All right, welcome everyone. Happy Valentine's Eve. Today, February 13th, we have our February Institute for Liberal Values Lab. The title is Right Swipe, Wrong Swipe, The Ethics of Romantic Preferences. I'm joined by Dr. Mark Horowitz, Associate Professor of Sociology at Seton Hall, and we'll be talking about a variety of different topics that are very appropriate for this time of year, Valentine's Day being tomorrow, Valentine's Eve being tonight, about the ethics of romantic preferences specifically. Mark, do you want to say something to introduce yourself further?
Sure, yeah. As Nafees just said, I'm a professor at Seton Hall University. I teach sociology. I'm interested in social theory, increasingly in biosociology and political psychology. And I think part of the motivation for this conversation was that a couple of years ago, I published a piece regarding a book on racial discrimination in dating, and that's sort of what spurred this conversation.
Yeah, well, let's get right into that, because you have not admitted to this over email, but the general public would consider you an expert in this topic, given the work that you've done. Perhaps even call you the love doctor in this regard.
Wow.
So would you tell us about the work that you've done in this sphere?
Well, it began, I guess, the summer when the book came out, would have been 2021, I believe. And I read this book called The Dating Divide. It's by Curington, Lundquist, and Lynn, these three sociologists. And I really strongly disliked the book. And doesn't mean it didn't have good dimensions or aspects to it. But the long and the short of it is the book analyzed discriminatory patterns in dating. Again, the book's called The Dating Divide. They had access to 1 million or more interactions. They got anonymously, they got access to a dating site, pretty large one. And they looked at 1 million interactions with people who someone sends a message to, who responds to that message. And they were able to establish an algorithm. And the findings that they had, turns out they echo pretty widely encountered findings. And I think when I say them, people are like, yeah, it makes sense. Even if you're not familiar with this literature, you'll note that it makes sense. I should say first, and they supplemented their quantitative analysis with 77 qualitative interviews with daters as well. We can talk about that. But in terms of their core findings, what they found is that some people get messaged more and some people get messaged less by both race and by sex. So by race, white men tend to, on dating sites, be the privileged ones. They'll get more attention. The groups that have the hardest time are Black women and Asian men that they discover, although they point out that Black men do, again, this is just measured by who reaches out to them, right? So they try to explain why this would be the case, that you see these patterns of racial discrimination in people's choices. And they make the argument that this is a reflection of racism, that we have historically inherited power relationships in society. Those power relations have been reinforced through the media, through public imagery, and through internalization. People have come to find themselves attracted to people based on their positions of status and power in society over time. So I can go more into it, but I'm sure you're.
Yeah, no, that really is interesting. Really sets up the basis for our conversation today. Those of you who are watching and listening, please chime in with your thoughts on YouTube and X, and if we can, we'll answer your comments and questions on air. So, racial preferences, since you've mentioned it, I suppose the question would be, should people's dating preferences be open to moral scrutiny?
Yeah, I find it to be a very difficult question, and I've been reflecting on it for years without a fixed answer. In preparation for this podcast, Nafees, I decided to consult the 21st century Oracle ChatGPT. And the Oracle informed me that if you have a racial preference that's natural, you just kind of find yourself naturally inclined, that's okay. But if your racial preference is based on internalized stereotyping of the outgroup, then it's problematic, as it will contribute to harm. Now, how one would disentangle what would be a sort of instinctual preference from a preference anchored in a stereotype isn't clear to me. So I think, and this sort of anticipates another question that we talked about earlier, Nafees, it's not that no preferences can ever be subject to moral scrutiny. And we all agree that age is an appropriate, dimension. We've established laws due to the emotional and physical development of children that it's not appropriate for adults to date them. Everybody agrees on that. So there's a case where the preference itself is policed, not just figuratively, but literally in our laws, right? So, but if we broaden outside of that one case and we raise this question of, well, what if someone says, well, I'm not, and this is something in the qualitative interviews that the authors of The Dating Divide discovered. A lot of respondents will say, well, I'm just not into Asians, or I'm just not into Black people to date. And they respond in the book by saying that might feel, this is what they literally say, by the way, your preference may feel natural, but in reality, it reflects the shameful roots of racism in our society that you've internalized. And so there's a kind of positionality that really rubbed me wrong. The reason why I didn't like the book was that it took on this kind of righteous moral posture where you're explaining racial preferences historically, which I consider to be one-sided, and we can get into that. But then you're also shaming your own interviewees and suggesting that their preferences really do reflect racism. What gets tricky, I'm sure if the authors were in the room, they would say, well, we didn't intend to shame them. We just want to encourage them to expand the horizons of their preferences in a more humane way. But again, I'm still undecided. Is it appropriate? Or more than is it appropriate? It happens. We know there's the empirical reality that people have racial preferences. So then the question becomes, is it appropriate to shame them? I mean, that's really the more fundamental question. Is it appropriate to say you should have a broader panoply of tastes with regard to dating? So that's trickier, I think.
Well, we know that, it's becoming more and more difficult to differentiate nature from nurture. What feels natural to us might actually be socialized behaviors. Over the course of time, what was thought to be attractive has changed greatly. About a century ago, fat was considered to be attractive because that was a sign of wealth. Now it's less fat because that's a sign of access to enough wealth to get to eat healthier foods and have access to gyms and fitness memberships and stuff. So, we can get socialized into thinking that we are naturally one way or another. So the line is certainly blurred between what's natural and what's nurture, what we learn. I do wonder if we're living in an environment, a dating environment where you get the best that you can get. And there is a trope that I also was looking at earlier, with the Super Bowl that just passed. And there's been a lot of sort of anecdotal conversations on TikTok about how some high-end athletes who are African American have chosen to have significant others who are white. And there are people that are it is what it is. They're attracted to whoever they're attracted to. But then there's another side that's suggesting that as soon as a Black man, for example, comes into a position of affluence, all of a sudden, since they appear to have access to white women in this particular example, then do they go after that which they think to be the highest in that, the hierarchy of dating. And I found that to be interesting because most of the TikTok videos are just like angry and not grounded in academia, but academia is downstream from culture and society. And so if society is going to have certain feelings and thoughts tied to, affluent Black men, overwhelmingly selecting to, or disproportionately, not overwhelmingly, disproportionately selecting to mate and marry white women or women outside of their race, maybe it's something worth looking into. Because in a free market, do you just get the best partner, quote unquote, best partner that you can get? But I'm not saying that that whiteness is better than Blackness or something like that. But as you've mentioned, there is a hierarchy that, a million data points apparently have shown when it comes specifically to race, and we'll get to other categories in a moment. But I wonder if in this capitalist dating environment, if people just mate and be with the best person that they can be with.
You raised so many points, and I have so many ideas swirling around in my head. I don't even know where to begin. One thing I should begin with is a point that I neglected to mention at the beginning when I was summarizing the dating divide. Turns out that men, on average, prefer women of their own racial group first. Mm-hmm. So they look at whites, Hispanics, Asians, and blacks. All men, on average, prefer. In other words, they'll message more often people of their own racial group first. Women, however, that's not the case. That's where white men tend to, non-white women will tend to message white men before even their own racial groups. I neglected to mention that. So even though the example you just gave, Nafees, that you'll see a lot of black men with white women, I don't want to suggest to the viewer that that's always the case in practice. Now, one could say, well, they're not because they can't, and it's the wealthy African American who has that option available to them. And there's literature on status exchange. This isn't only among high status African Americans, it's also low status. Sometimes the claim will be made that why we see that pairing so often is that white women are exchanging their higher racial status for a more attractive black man, even if the black man's not of high status materially, right? So that's been a common theme that's out there. But again, this idea that there are these deep preferences, the preferences are patterned. How do we go about explaining them, and whether we should participate in shaming with regard to them? I'm sure what you were talking about, I haven't read what you were talking about earlier, Nafees, but you mean the kind of like how people are going to jump in and condemn someone. Oh, look, who's a black guy who's dating a white woman. And that's common. You'll see a lot of animosity come out where people will, organize around their ethnic identity, right? Your earlier question, I don't know it well enough, but I've never been totally sold on the idea that, in the Middle Ages, overweight women were the more attractive ones. I know the Rubenesque paintings suggest that, but I've never really, I haven't dived in deep enough to either reject or accept that premise. What I would say, though, is my inclination, I've been influenced by evolutionary psychology on this. My interest and my inclination is to believe that there are certain universal tendencies that are pursued. I think with body weight, you're going to see some variation. There can be, some array of variation around the world for that, to be sure. Evolutionary psychology will point to other traits, of course, like the hourglass figure. For men, physical height as more attractive, and then neoteny, or the preservation of youthful features later into life, will be often seen as attractive by men toward women. I'm not remembering your last point, though, that we said, but I threw a lot back at you.
You covered it. It was just a status change that happens, that we were talking about from a racial standpoint. You mentioned weight and height as well. And this is a very touchy topic, because everywhere you look, this is what's going on, especially in the non-academic circles. The question is usually, well, does height matter to a heterosexual woman's preferences? Quite often it does. And then if the general public is welcoming of that perspective, should they not then be welcoming of the perspective that weight might matter to a heterosexual man's perspective? And some of the digging deep parts is that, weight is much easier to control than height is. In fact, height is nearly impossible to control outside of, some ritualistic practices that I don't think there's any empirical evidence that you can actually influence height post-birth. But weight, it again differs from person to person, but it's much easier it's more controllable than height is. And thus, sort of the point counterpoint thing that I've done with some of my students is that, well, don't you think it's more inappropriate to discriminate against a short man than against an obese or fat woman? And they sort of understand that, but then once we start going in that direction, I posit the idea that perhaps being overweight is more shameful because it indicates decisions that have been made that have resulted in that. Whereas if you are a short man and you're made fun of for being a short man, it kind of doesn't, the insults really don't stick because there's nothing that you could have done anyway. So it's kind of like, oh, whatever. Yeah, I guess I'm short because I couldn't have done anything. But I've always found my feelings to be hurt more when I was insulted on something that I had control over. And I wonder if that's what makes being judgmental towards someone who is overweight more hurtful than judgment against someone who may be short.
It's quite plausible. With regard to preference, though, I think both matter a great deal. One of the things when I was preparing for the essay that I wrote on the dating divide, I looked at tons of profiles and dating sites, and how often women will say, some of them quite apologetically, they'll say, "I'm so sorry if you're under 6 feet. I really wish you well, but I'm not interested." And it's deep empathy. You can feel for the person, the man who's 5'6" and sort of struggling with that, right? The dating divide also did find, though, that body weight was quite predictive, very significant in terms of men's interests and who they would message back. So yeah, these are salient characteristics. My big concern is being able to, and this goes way beyond just this issue, Nafees. My big concern is making sure we have space in contemporary society to be able to talk about claims without prompting shaming or moralizing. For people to be able to just have a conversation without people jumping and making a claim, oh, you must have some kind of agenda, you must be aiming to hurt people or something like that. That said, when I teach evolutionary psychology, I'm extremely sensitive about it. I usually give a very big preamble about how a lot of this material can be very sensitive, because, who wants to scream at people about, oh, you're a short man, no woman's going to love you or something like that. I mean, it would be cruel. But we are living in a time where I think it's concerning. I just read an essay, I can't remember who the author was, just the other day, about how in certain circles on the internet, some of these evolutionary psychological findings lead to a kind of cynicism and depression, really, among kind of the especially men on the far right who don't feel like they fit a certain body type. So I'm sure you've heard of the incels.
Oh yeah.
So very angry men who don't perceive themselves to be attractive in the dating market, and they do have, many of them will openly say, yeah, I'm short, I'm overweight, I'm bald, I got no shot. And they'll just in the forums, they'll talk very open about this. Some of them aren't angry, some of them are just deeply sad. One of the things, again, that makes it very difficult to talk about this stuff, I think we live in a time that could be kind of a time of kind of compassionate dishonesty. Where people don't want to confront these empirical realities of human nature and attraction, or at least attribute even a biological component to them, because once you attribute any biology to these preferences, you're rendering them unchangeable, at least in part. And so I think partly out of a spirit of compassion, there's this discussion, and this is so common, certainly in the Dating Divide book, but it's extremely common in popular culture. You'll hear essay and article after article, our culture values. Our culture says this. And I think the undergirding reason people say our culture values it is the implicit message will be, it could be different, right? That message is a wonderful one to tell people, but if it's not ultimately accurate as part of our human preference matrix that people will have for evolutionary reasons, there's a part of me that believes part of wisdom is being honest with yourself, I think, in part. I remember when I got glasses as a little kid, it traumatized me. And the first year I actually squinted. I go to the eye doctor, I squint as hard as I can. And then I suffered an entire year. Because I didn't get the glasses because I could actually see when I squinted. So it was bruising to my self-concept. But part of wisdom is just we're not going to be the most attractive. We're not going to be the funniest. We're not going to be the smartest, and sort of make peace with who we are. And yet so much of the culture today, and not just on the issue of dating, but so much of the culture today is a kind of noble lie where people are willing to say, oh no, I wrote this in the dating dupe. There's literally a line. It's their most extreme line where they say, it's not that there are any bodies that are objectively more attractive than any other. Embodied attractiveness is often a product of the racial hierarchy. So they're basically just saying there's no difference. Everyone is, we concoct a culture somewhere where a very short, overweight man would be like the Brad Pitt of that epoch or something like that. And I don't know if those sorts of messages, even if they're compassionately motivated, really ultimately engender health in the person you're telling them to. And I'm sorry I've talked so long, but this leads to a question for you, Nafees. and tell me if I'm wrong, isn't part of social work having to sort of let someone know that their behavior is actually, they have to really come to understand that they're living either a delusional or they're destructive. You really kind of have to have a sense of what's really going on.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, 100%, social work and, really just being a good person involves sometimes telling, ugly truths instead of beautiful lies. And so with that beautiful lie perspective, if we're telling someone who data shows is not going to have the best time in the world in the dating market, and we tell them and we gas them up and make them believe that they are the Brad Pitt at 5'6", that we're setting them up for a lifetime of mistrust, where they'll figure it out very quickly that they are not at the top of that dating food chain, and then they'll question all of the advice that they've heard and question their very reality. And so, in doing so, I wonder if all of these beautiful lies that have been told for men and women, over the course of these centuries is now resulting in somewhat of a revolt. So you mentioned incels. For those in the audience that don't know, that's involuntary celibates. There are also, parallel movements like MGTOW, men going their own way, red pill content related to the Matrix, and people, just men in particular in this example, just saying, well, if I'm not going to be, someone's first choice, then I'm not going to be a choice at all. And so that lends itself to what we're seeing now in the loneliness epidemic, in that people are having almost, not almost, clearly unrealistic expectations of their prospective partners, because as a result of just being lied to for so long. All of these beautiful lies. You're the most, your grandma always tells you, like, you're so handsome, women are going to be lining up at the door for you, and then you're like, where? The door's open, door's unlocked, there's no one there, and you start to question everything, and you think to yourself, well, if this is what I was told and this isn't what's happening, then I don't know what to trust anymore. I think we do a grave disservice to people when we tell them these beautiful lies, because temporarily, from a professional setting, for a moment, let's imagine that we're not, faculty members, professors, or friends, but just practitioners. The easiest way to do practice would be to tell our clients exactly what they want to hear. We'll continue to collect insurance money from them if you're a private practice, or however way they pay. They'll keep coming to us because we're telling them these beautiful lies. And I think it's disingenuous. It's when we tell them the ugly truth and say, no, listen, what your perspective of the world, your worldview is incorrect, and that's what you're seeing. That's why you continue to come to me, and you're going to need to make some adjustments as far as who you want to be with, and how likely do you think that's going to happen. Those are difficult conversations, but difficult conversations often result in clients not returning. And I wonder if there's a professional incentive to continue to tell beautiful lies, and maybe that's why we continue to do it.
That's certainly conceivable, disturbing as it is. I was thinking as you were talking there too, just of a concrete example. So one of the points I made in the dating divide is I supplemented the hypotheses. Everything that the authors say in the dating divide, every disparity in rating in preferences in dating, they attribute to racism and stereotyping. So if someone doesn't prefer this group, it's because they've internalized the racism. That's why I call the essay the dating dupe. We're duped. We're just totally internalizing. We have no actual instinctual agency that's biologically informed, right? I obviously reject that view. It's not that I reject the social influence. I just think it interacts with biology, right? And with the social psychological level as well. So Asian men have a very, very hard time. It's been widely documented. Curington, Lundquist, and Lin were not the first to discover that. There have been other books. This book, Dataclysm by Christian Rudder, a whole bunch of research on this showing the same patterns, right? So let's say I'm right, hypothetically, and that one of the reasons Asian men do poorly is because they're on average 3 inches shorter. They often don't have the same physical stature of other racial ethnic groups on average, and that doesn't align with lots of women's preferences, right? To tell them that, well, these are white European beauty standards. Going back to your point earlier, Nafees, it's like, what chain of thought will flow out of this? Well, I can see one, resentment. hostility. These white Europeans are imposing, or sometimes they'll say oppressing or imposing their beauty standards on subordinate groups in order to marginalize them. So kind of like flirting with the idea that some of these standards have a kind of collectively conspiratorial intent. None of these things to me foster collective trust. So what I find, as painful as a lot of evolutionary literature is in explaining human preferences, what I find liberating about it is that we get a scientific understanding of these preferences that exempts us from what otherwise would be a kind of cynical interpretation toward different racial ethnic groups, which couldn't be more important right now because we're so polarized along racial and political lines.
Yeah, we certainly are. And the preferences that have been studied, there's empirical evidence to that. And now, sort of looking toward the future, there are new preferences coming up, on a regular basis, whether it's based on, historical cultural values, or if it's just new technology that's advancing. So some of the newer dating preferences that I've seen mentioned are body count, how many sexual partners someone has had. And that goes back to, centuries when virgins were expected, at marriage. Now that seems to be making a comeback. Just the term body count, if you type in hashtag body count, it's very popular on all these social media networks because, people are looking for people who have not, or partners who have not, accrued a large body count. I wanted to know what you thought of that as far as being a dating preference.
It's unbelievable you raised that because I've actually talked with colleagues about wanting to do a study on it. Literally talked to them. I want to do a large survey. I even typed at one point in the Google Scholar whether that's been done in evolutionary psychology. I know one of the books I read where David Buss, he's probably the leading evolutionary psychologist in the country. One of his essays, he says that he explored like preference for virginity and it wasn't confirmed. Again, this is hazy memory here. So at least in one study, it didn't confirm his hypothesis. But that said, the evolutionary psychological logic is palpable. I mean, you look around the world, the old days in Latin America, if the wife didn't bleed on her wedding day, the consequences would be harsh. You look, again, distasteful, but if you look at hymen reconstruction, around the world. This seems to me to be almost self-evidently linked to male desire. From an evolutionary point of view, if a woman has child or shows a behavioral tendency to be with other men, it means the baby may not be yours.
Right.
And so we've developed, the evolutionary psychologists argue, a kind of emotive architecture that's going to be attuned to markers of promiscuity, and we're going to find that to be less desirable. Again, if you're a sociologist who operates solely in the sphere of culture, sometimes they're derisively called blank slaters. If you're operating from that standpoint, then you're only going to see these sorts of preferences as rooted in patriarchy or in domination or something like that. I find the evolutionary psychological explanation to be certainly at the very least a supplement, if not even more compelling, for why we see these disturbing tendencies in society. So let's do the study together, Nafees. I'm not kidding.
Oh yeah, it's
I'm very, very interested in it. I want to see if it's happening in society. There's so much, and of course conservatives talk about this, but so much hypersexualization, and then of course the market intersects with that. I teach a course in mass media where we talk a lot about how, capitalism is going to pander to whatever makes money.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. And sexuality makes money. And so they're going to continue to cater. Obviously, we're obese because fast food makes money. Right. So these tendencies can, I think, eclipse other dimensions of human health and psychological health. Like your earlier point about, when we were talking about the incels and stuff, it really speaks to a lack of a kind of core moral sense of self. If you feel you're not the most attractive, therefore you're going to leave the dating scene. But again, that's what you'll get. You'll read Reddit, or you'll read other streams, and you'll see people talking about a lot of resentment, where like 20% of the men on dating sites get, something like 80 to 90% of the tension. And so it fosters this feeling of resentment among men. And I know Jordan Peterson, I think a number of years ago, got in trouble when he said we ought to have mandatory one man, one woman, or something like that.
Oh yeah, I didn't know that.
You heard about that? Yeah.
Yeah.
But I can understand the spirit behind what he said. It's like if you have a moral system where even the most rich and powerful are morally compelled to have only one spouse, it means they're not going to be hoarding, the mating. And that, to me, I can understand how that could lead to a greater degree of social harmony than we have today. So if these preferences are indeed biologically, at least in part, biologically real, and we have to be honest about that, we do need to have that inform policy in some way, or try to build consensus on how we respond to it.
Yeah, I do. I also think promiscuity lends itself to false understandings of self-worth, for example, because it's much easier to have sex with someone than it is to be in a relationship with them. Two people might just be in the mood on a certain day, and one person might be objectively lower on the attractiveness hierarchy than the other, and now they'll have sex just because they have nothing better to do on a Tuesday night. And now the person lower on the hierarchy now expects all of their future partners and future relationships to be with a person of this particular higher up in the hierarchy. And that contaminates the entire dating pool, because people walk around with unrealistic expectations of what they see in the mirror. They'll look at themselves and say, well, I once had sex with an NBA basketball player, and so now I'm only gonna consider relationships with NBA basketball. There is a good amount of promiscuity that comes along with status, particularly for men. And just because a man has had sex with you doesn't necessarily mean that they would have engage in a relationship with you. But what it tells the brain is that, okay, so this is my level now, when it's really not.
Yeah, no, I agree. And this is something you see a lot in the conservative media, just concern about, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm interested in it. The Case Against Feminism. I'm trying to remember or against the Feminist Revolution, something like that, where the author basically just says that this idea, and she's not alone in saying this, that the idea that women can act like men, which we can say, yes, the double standard was unfair. A man shouldn't be called a stud and a woman called another S word for the same behavior, right? We can all agree that that's an unfair double standard, but that doesn't mean the sexes are the same. And the sort of narrative that's oftentimes offered to women: take control of your sexuality, act like men do, enjoy sex for the same reason. Well, it may not. I mean, the jury's out, but the argument is that it may not lead to a lot of health among young women, who the evolutionary psychology literature shows very clearly that it's women who experience sexual regret. Very rare for a man to go, oh, I feel like I was played. I really regret sleeping with that woman. It almost never happens yet. It's not uncommon at all for women to experience that.
Yeah, that's true. And definitely, once we're done, I'll send you an email. We can start building some sort of IRB related to research.
I'm actually serious about it, so I hope that's true.
Me too.
And this is another evolutionary psychological concept or we've already been talking about it, that speaks to this idea of compassionate lying. Like, even the principle, I remember when I first read this stuff, I'm pretty introspective, and I just remember feeling physical disgust sometimes reading it, and just discomfort, like the whole idea that we have mate values.
Yeah.
It's not, no one wants to hear it. It's like, it's painful, so it's not just height, what's your physical proportion? How intelligent are you? Right. For women, how, what's your waist hip ratio? How beautiful are you? Do your features suggest you're younger or older? Those sorts of things. All of those things can be very painful for us, going back to the idea of wisdom and, sort of accepting the cards that we've been dealt. A lot of us don't want to do that. And again, there's this kind of, going back to your earlier point, Nafees, sadly, these physical traits, and then the access in the mass media to not just the lifestyles of the rich and famous, but the beautiful, and everything that they gain, it seems to be fostering a kind of collective bitterness and resentment and resignation among a lot of people in society, that are undermining healthy sexual and social relationships.
Yeah, 100%. The entire dating environment, romantic environment, is not fair, but it's unfair for different reasons. Men, generally have to produce their value over the course of time, getting taller, gaining status, gaining, wealth, whereas women historically have been tasked with preserving their value. So it's a difference between producing value for men and preserving value for women. So if men were to think the way that women would, or women were to think the way that men would, they might find themselves in a place where they feel unfulfilled by their romantic endeavors. That it really is an interesting topic because there's just so many different preferences that we can dissect. So far, we've talked about height and weight and body count. Another thing that has been popping up lately is people who, I don't know if you think of this as more controlling or not, but like men who have gone on record in saying that they do not want their significant others to have social media or to wear makeup. And I find like there's the social worker in me, all of my education suggests, okay, this could be controlling behavior, but then, common sense isn't always aligned with academia. And, it aligns with the idea that people are cheating on each other. Still, I don't know if it's more than historically because we didn't keep records of that. But is it possible that social media and makeup open the door more for potential infidelity, and that's what people are trying to protect against?
That strikes me immediately, as you said, it would strike me as plausible. I think however we talk about this, I think the first step is always an impulse toward a kind of libertarianism that, yes, you're free to do what you want to do. I'm not saying I would necessarily, try to prohibit that or not in my relationship. I'm just saying in talking to people, it's not about what people should do. It's about understanding what the implications are and trying to explain it. So yeah, I can see how that can lead to just feelings of complete distrust. There's all the data suggests that I've looked at, and it indicates that that social trust is at its all-time low, in each other, in our social institutions. And this is concerning to me. We're moving more and more toward a society of kind of atomized individualism. Mm-hmm. And so I can sort of understand the impulse if indeed it's demonstrated. And some of Jonathan Haidt's latest work, of course, shows the negative impact on children. It follows a kind of common sense. We know that mass media is doing this, especially to young girls, in terms of self-esteem and things of this sort. So maybe we do need to deeply evaluate what the implications are of social media. It's never going to be one size fits all. I usually tell people, and I'm not a psychologist, or a social worker, but I usually tell people when they're thinking about dating and what's right or wrong, usually people will say, well, what's the right position on this? And I'll say, well, the right position is to meet someone who agrees with you.
Right.
Less than it being some sort of transcendently right thing.
Yeah.
So people are going to have different preferences in mating, who they mate with. That matters a lot. Now, that said, obviously we can still use the tools of science to help better understand the implications of and have that inform the conversation as long as the only thing I'm allergic to is shaming.
Yeah.
I can't have conversations with people that are going to, my research in recent years deals with shaming. It deals with how certain positions in controversies are deeply moralized, and to try to bring science into the conversation usually prompts all these outcries of people that accuse someone of having a nefarious agenda and things like that. That's the only thing I'm allergic to.
Yeah. You can't negotiate attraction. And so, one of the elephants in the room here is that, ultimately the answer to what are, immoral dating preferences, we can deem certain dating preferences immoral, and yet you don't have to consider them immoral, speaking to our audience specifically. And so if you have a particular race in mind, if you have a particular height in mind, if you have a particular weight in mind, no Institute for Liberal Values lab is going to change your mind, and it shouldn't. Conversations like this only lend themselves to the idea that there are so many different perspectives that it should hopefully validate the perspectives, the individual perspectives that our audiences have. So, you said it best in that, like, it's not about having the right dating preferences. It's about having the right dating preferences for the person that you are with or aiming to be with. Are you aligned with each other, or is this unaligned? In which case, likely to potentially break up. We have a couple of comments here questions there. So this also goes to the health issues. We can say fat is beautiful, quote unquote, fat is beautiful, but if it is unhealthy, are we contributing to the lie? How can we be honest and still be compassionate? That's a good question, because, it's we want to make each other feel good. That particular element is, if I say that you are unattractive, then you might say that I'm unattractive. So, in this sort of hive mind perspective, maybe when I tell you that you are obese but still attractive, the reason why I'm doing so is so that you will also compliment me, and we'll all compliment each other, and we will live in this beautiful lie utopia where none of us, tell each other the truth, and it still makes us feel good. But ultimately, if that means that we are very unhealthy and dealing with medical conditions as a result, how much solace would we find in preserving our mental health at the detriment of our physical health?
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I would add to it too when it comes to something like that. I think people at the end of the day know the data and the dating divide and many other pieces on this show that overweight people do struggle more. So they've had a lifetime of rejection. So it's interesting that we feel this compulsion for this kind of discreet dishonesty, when in reality you're not being honest with them. And now, of course, what makes it especially troubling, you had mentioned that it's, we can control what we eat. The behavioral genetics literature shows how heritable. It turns out body weight, this surprised me when I read it, is highly heritable, almost as heritable as height, believe it or not. In other words, the metabolism really matters. Someone can, I had a friend in college I used to go to Chinese restaurants. He'd have plate after plate, thinnest guy in the world, And then there's other people eat like part of a cookie and it just morphs into body fat like immediately, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm not even allowed to look at cookies. So.
I don't bring them home. I have no chocolate chip cookies or anything. I can't. Every single time I go to the supermarket, I tell myself a comforting lie. I say, this time it'll be different, Mark. You'll eat one cookie a day and it'll last a whole week. Next day, I'm physically sick. I ate the entire thing.
Oh yeah. I'll eat cookies by the sleeve. Like, I don't even count per cookie. But yeah, it's true. It's certainly heritable. There's no doubt about that. The question, of course, is how heritable, compared to height, for example. Next question, we have here is producing value and preserving value. These differences are fascinating. What does that say about differences in sexes, if anything? And, my perspective is that it speaks volumes about the differences in sexes. It's unfair to men that an 18-year-old man, technically an adult, would have very little relative value compared to that same man at the age of 45 or 50. However, the inverse is often true for women, where, at the age of 18 or 20 or 21, from a dating perspective, that is, not personal value. I can't stress that enough, that there's a difference between dating value and personal value. Personal value could have a woman who's 18 years old, just out of high school, going to college, and then at the age of 45 or 50, a CEO, CFO. That's a different style of value than dating and romantic value. And it is unfair, nevertheless, factual over the course of empirical data, that, it's unfair to men that they have so little value at the age of 18. And it's unfair to women that they have so little value, romantic value, at the age of 50.
No, absolutely. And as you were saying that, Nafees, I'm thinking part of it is like a function of the technology itself, because, all this talk about all these mate value traits. I mean, at the end of the day, the touchy-feely ones are what matter to people. People care about love. They care about sense of humor. They care about compassion, a whole bunch of important things that are crucial to stress. But you can't access that when you're swiping left or right. All you get to see are the physical things. And so that engenders, and in tandem with mass media, which shows the lifestyles of the beautiful and the rich, all of that in their intersection, I think, engenders these feelings of resentment, turning away from it because it's painful. The reasons I said to you earlier, right? Yeah. I don't know if there's other. I was going to return to something, but if there's other questions or comments, I didn't want to.
No, those are the comments so far. But I definitely wanted to leave time for one of the questions that I've been saving for this, a portion of the conversation, is: can ideological or political alignment as a dating criterion be seen as legitimate or exclusionary? So we've seen a good amount of data come out just more recently from Pew Research showing how if two people don't agree on political terms, then it's seen as a disqualifier. perhaps even more so now in this hyperpolarized political environment. And I wanted to hear your thoughts, and I'll also be chiming in afterwards about political and ideological preferences in dating.
Yeah, no, I would reiterate what I said earlier. I mean, to me, it's all about if you're not causing harm. So, with the exception of age, I would be disinclined to want to moralize or politicize around people's preferences. I mean, we're probably going to see less and less of James Carville and Mary Matlin, I think her name was. We're going to see that's going to be less and less the more we kind of sort more and more into these political camps and surround ourselves with people that think and feel the way we do. It's one of the interesting findings in political psychology, and it blew my mind. I had no idea. Turns out there's a high degree of, believe it or not, genetic influence, biological influence on our politics. It's not that there's a gene, of course, for the Democratic Party, but what there are there's clusters of genes that influence our emotions, and those emotions nudge us to different political teams. And it's very easy for people of different moral psychologies to see the other team as just intrinsically bad people morally. Of course, Jonathan Haidt's classic work, The Righteous Mind, deals with this. If you're a liberal, you're seeing everything through the sphere of compassion. So any policy, for example, that would stop some child from crossing the border who's hungry, to the progressive mind is just anathema, right? So, and then you're going to date someone who wants to harm the outsider. It would be inconceivable, right? So again, I'm less inclined to believe we should moralize any of this, and I'm just deeply interested in understanding these patterns from a scientific standpoint.
Yeah, I'm curious to see, and this is another study that we can do at some point where, couples of varying degrees as far as how long they've been together, of different political leanings, how do they get along with one another? Are there conversations that they choose not to have? And I'm most interested in finding out what are the factors that were so profound in your partner and your significant other that made you overlook the political differences. Because that's what I find thinking to myself, because I've seen several students come up and talk about how their boyfriends and their girlfriends are of a different political lean than they are. And I find that to be really riveting, because these days every conversation turns into politics in one way or another. I don't know about you, I'm kind of tired of it, but I don't think we're going backwards. And if anything, we're getting more polarized. But in doing so, I'm very curious to learn more about people who are dating each other, and they're both on two different political sides. I find that to be really just the definition of inclusivity, of understanding that the very person that you share a bed with is someone that thinks differently from you ideologically and politically. And so I find that to be very, very interesting.
I would love to see more of it. The old Mark, I don't think we talked about this, Nafees, but for much of my adult life until about 10 years ago, I was really on the far left, social justice oriented guy. I would not have dated a right winger because I would have seen it through the lens of it's just immoral. And I've radically transformed into what you could call a kind of communitarian, where I just find it so deeply important. I think many of us in the heterodox community do, to be actively engaging people and ideas that run counter our assumptions. And the growth has just been extraordinary. I would never want to go back to that kind of one-sidedness. And then with romantic relationships too, it means those other things. Once you see that people's political sensibilities are at least in part natural, it opens the door to being able to appreciate the whole person. And those other things, like the capacity for compassion, that's not left or right. Compassion, for, I said earlier, sense of humor, that's not left or right. The personality traits charisma is not left or right. Things that we value and cherish don't fit those political categories, and to exclude people on that grounds is really sad. I would love to see more rather than less of it, but I think you're right. It's probably increasingly uncommon for people to be dating across political lines.
Yeah, and I think it continues to contribute to the loneliness epidemic. We've got declining birth rates in Western civilization. So, humanity needs people to get married and have children, desperately so. In places like South Korea, I believe, are at 0.7 children per or child per woman, and replacement levels is 2.1 children per woman. And so, Western civilization has prioritized status, career, working, and contributing to the economy, and putting off marriage and parenthood until much later. And now it's gotten to the point where later is like, well, I'm kind of used to this. I kind of enjoy my peace. I don't, I'm too old to take care of a newborn. So, and I'm happy enough, so now you have a lot of people making the decision to not be parents. Anecdotally, as you spoke about yourself, the same is true with me. As I was growing up, I would also always think to myself, I want to be the kind of dad that my dad was or is. He's still alive, and I prioritize my career, and now I'm at a point where having children, it's like, well, they're gonna cry. There's changing diapers, and there's so many different things that go into it, which would be beautiful and miraculous for many. I feel like now I've made the decision to not be a parent, and just think of my career as my child.
Yeah, I think the acronym is DINK, isn't it? Dual income, no children.
Yeah.
I plead guilty also.
Yeah.
To the same scenario. I think we all can agree, though, we need more pronatal policy. I mean, I think even those on the political right, I think, are open to much more affordable childcare.
Yeah.
We can advance these goals, right? Let me briefly return, unless you had another question from the audience, because we never quite arrived at going back to the race issue, which is most sensitive in my view. One of the points I make in the paper that's most controversial, that's why I published it in Journal of Controversial Ideas, is that it's very likely to be at least in part natural to prefer someone. And I prefer to call it biocultural. So it's ethnically reproduced, but it's also biological in part. But that, for many, many people, is just anathema. The idea that people could have an instinctual preference for their own race, particularly. But it's just something that strikes me as highly plausible that exists. As I said earlier, all men prefer women of their own racial group first. Mm-hmm. So there's widespread evidence of assortative mating, of endogamy. All these things suggest to me that it's very, very likely that those preferences are at least in part innate.
I'd be curious to see how much there is an overlap between those preferences of in-group racial preferences and the amount of influence that the opposite sex parent had on on raising that particular individual, because we model our relationships based on what we've seen. And so if my mom and dad acted in a certain way, I might associate my mom being of a particular race, my race obviously, to then thinking to myself, okay, so women of my race act in this kind of way. I see part of my dad in myself. I see myself as an extension of my dad. And thus, if my dad is married to my mom, then me being an extension of my dad would likely need to find someone who is an extension of my mom. And that might be a way where, people might want to stay within their own racial group in dating.
Yeah, you're kind of hitting on the point. I think these are not separate explanations; they're integrated. So a biological instinct can be mediated through cultural processes in the home, right? There can be imprinting, there can be outright social influence. So many, everything's happening all at once, right? We're always embedded in a wider social context. One of the things that I just in my adult thinking that I'm inclined to do, though, is to be integrated, to always be thinking about how biopsych and social phenomena intersect in interesting ways. Going back to the earlier point we discussed, though, many social scientists and observers, I think out of compassion, want to exclude the biological component of it, just from the standpoint of like, well, maybe we could organize things differently. And people on the liberal left, there's lots of psychological evidence for this, are much more inclined toward the outsider. So they're kind of xenophilic, where conservatives are more ethnophilic, kind of toward the in-group. So that xenophilia that animates, and of course, academia is overwhelmingly liberal left. So it ends up kind of promulgating a perspective of, if we were a healthy species, we wouldn't have these preferences. They're not natural anyway. They lead to all these social inequalities. So let's promulgate the idea, in some cases, like in the dating divide, let's shame people if they, have these preferences. And from my standpoint on it is, we need to really get the science right. I believe through looking, I don't know if we have time right now to go into it, but there's a wide array of evidence, not just humans, obviously in the animal kingdom, you see assortative mating, you see aspects of where there's a whole body of controversial theory called genetic similarity.
Mm-hmm.
It just turns out husbands and wives are much closer to each other genetically than two random people.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, there's a wide array of evidence for that. So what seems to be going on is when you're meeting someone, your brain's acting in ways you're not conscious of, and you're picking up signals of familiarity. That the idea opposites attract has been disconfirmed when it comes to studies of most people's attraction. Anyway, I don't know what that ding was. That might be a time limit.
Oh no, that's it was just a statement from Jen saying that we don't have to necessarily end on the hour.
Okay, sure. Go any direction we want.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a comment here asking, how do we square this idea of pronatal policy with the feminist assertion that women should have the same workplace opportunities?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it ends up cascading into so many other assumptions. Mm-hmm. I think we have to endorse both. I mean, maybe they're in tension with each other, but it doesn't mean we don't advocate both of them.
Yeah,
and, we can, of course, if again, I'll bring back evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology will suggest that men, on average, are going to be more status striving. Mm-hmm. Their preference, which is partly built in, is going to want to be pursuing these things because of this long history of our species where women will find men of high status more attractive.
Yeah.
So even if we have a completely gender egalitarian work regime, we're still going to see these disparities coming out in the work world. I think though we should just advocate in the letter of the law, encourage fathers to be as equally engaged in their children and childcare and so on.
Yeah.
But I agree with the spirit of the questioner who sees a little bit of tension there.
Yeah, certainly. And this, we don't want to take away people's autonomy while acknowledging the biological imperative and the differences between the biological sexes too. What is the perfect gray area for that? We're still trying to figure that out. But all too often people tend to think that it's a binary decision. Either we are, patriarchally, archaically biological, right, or we are so progressive that we don't know our men from our women. And, it's usually somewhere in between. And again, we are trying to figure that out. Going back to the topic of race, I'm curious if you would go into some of your hypotheses, because you mentioned that Black women specifically are the least messaged. Would you be able to sort of dissect as to why it's specifically Black women that are least messaged and not, let's say, Black men or white women? Why specifically Black women?
I didn't go there ultimately in the Dating Divide book because it's the most sensitive of all. So I kind of strategically avoided it a bit. I did throughout the piece, I rejected this solely, racism explanation. On one level, because they'll say, well, it's about money and power and status. And then of course, Black women are doing better by far than Black men on that. And yet they do worse. Yeah. So I sort of eliminate things to just show that there's more going on than just racism. So I'll get to your question, Nafees. I'm just going to a little bit through the back door. So I end up focusing on how Asian women tend to be preferred rather than why Black women are not preferred.
Fair enough, yeah.
I can't remember the researcher's name. He has this very unfortunate style of presentation. He wrote a very polemical piece. It was insensitive. I literally think he titled it like "Black Women Are Less Attractive" or something utterly uncompassionate, something like that.
Yeah.
Where he talked about testosterone and made the argument that Black people in general have higher degrees of testosterone. Made the argument that Black women are hence more masculine, and that could be playing some kind of role in it. As open-tent as I am, and as allergic as I am to shaming, I'm a little fearful of even entering this because naturalizing this disparity will certainly trigger lots of reactions in people about why that would be the case. But this is a piece of it. This applies to Black people in general, not just Black women. Which is controversial in the piece, which I was nervous when I wrote, was just the issue of cultural capital. even if we accept completely the progressive view that the differences in cultural capital, let me back up. So cultural capital in sociology is this idea that there are certain modes of behaving, of speaking and presenting yourself that are valued by the dominant society. So the example I gave in the paper is like speaking in formal English, dressing appropriately if you go to a job interview. That sort of thing. An example of cultural capital, right? So I suggested in the piece that there's disparities in cultural capital, in the capacity to speak formal English and how you carry yourself and that sort of thing, your worldliness and your knowledge about the world. And there are disparities by race in those things. I think we have to be honest about that reality, right? So I raised the question that that's no doubt playing some role in the marginalization of racial ethnic groups in terms of the overall data. So is it the case, for example, if someone were to exclude, I'll be blunt, a Black woman or a Black man on the grounds that they're likely not to have as much cultural capital, would that be an example of racism, right? Very, very, very sensitive. I think that's part of it, though. And people say this kind of stuff over the dinner table, and yet we fear because of how we can be quoted out of context.
Right, it's true.
People are going to reject people that are disproportionately likely to be disadvantaged. And I had a conversation with a colleague of mine on this once too, and he had told me in a kind of spirit of kind of wincing. He said, "Well, I considered dating a Black woman once, but she came from this, I won't name the place, this economically disadvantaged place, and so I dated her once, and I realized that her family had all these economic struggles, and I knew that I was going to have all these economic struggles." It sounds so callous and cruel, but who am I to judge him?
Right.
So some people can make a kind of, they so different than the dating divide. Dating divide would simply say you're concealing your racism and you're feeling, disgust or hostility toward the other group. When in reality, it's making a kind of rational calculation with regard to the likely economic consequences. So much is going on. You have economic inequality, you have cultural difference, you have biological difference, you have cultural capital.
Yeah.
The argument about testosterone, super controversial, but I know it's been out there too. So many things. My big thing is we need to be able to talk about this stuff without someone jumping on you as if it's kind of agenda. And I would argue the most sensitive topics are the most important ones to talk about.
100%. I couldn't agree with you more. Mark Horowitz, I really appreciate this conversation today. Once again, Dr. Mark Horowitz, Associate Professor of Sociology at Seton Hall University. Such a wonderful conversation. I mean it. I'm going to email you right after we sign off here.
I look forward to it. I look forward to working with you.
Me too. And I think, you hit the nail on the head in that this is an area of research that I'm sure others are curious about, but they don't want to get canceled. And I think we need to change the narrative of this. We are an academic, mindset where if the information is offensive, then the information is still the information. Whether or not it's offensive should not be a factor in how or whether it's disseminated. And so, hopefully there will be researchers that continue to take on studies that the general public might find distasteful, but still has an appetite for that information to be shared. So I look forward to working with you.
Yeah, and there's a way to do that. I think we both agree compassionately.
Yeah.
There's ways to frame things, and I think both of us want to do that, especially if we venture into these more contentious terrain.
Exactly, 100%. Well, Mark, it's been a pleasure.
Yes,
I look forward to speaking with you soon.
All right, thanks so much, Nafees.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.